Welcome everyone to the Dr. Todd Talks Tune Show. I am your host, Dr. Todd Samra, and today we are going to be talking about pluralism in music. More specifically, the age of pluralism in music. I believe that it is time that we stop referring to music of the 20th century as music of the 20th century. I mean, there's nothing wrong with telling people when you're talking about 16th century music or 17th century music to refer to it as such. But we all kind of understand that those time periods represent a certain era in music. The 16th century belongs to the Renaissance, and the 17th century begins the Baroque era. So what name can we give to the 20th century? The 20th century, with all of these different things going on, all of these different types of music, what is one word that can unify every part of the 20th and 21st century, really, as we know it? And I believe that word is pluralism. If we really examine the departure from the Romantic era, well, maybe first we should look at the departure from the Classical era into the Romantic era with Beethoven. That Beethoven, everything was bigger, larger, louder, softer, longer. It was just bigger and it was more expressive. Beethoven changed things and really ushered in the Romantic era. And the Romantic era was pervasive. It can be found in mythology and literature, operas, romance, all kinds of different things. Fascination with spirituality and darkness and the macabre, and all of these different things are part of really Romanticism. So when does Romanticism end? We don't really have a fixed end date for it, but it starts to dissipate slowly. And what I want to propose is that in the music after Wagner, things begin to change, but a lot of that music is still part of what we would consider to be Romanticism. If we look at Mahler, Richard Strauss, the post-Romantics, well, they're post what? Post-Romantics, so they're still part of Romanticism. And the one that I think really challenges people is the second Viennese school, the Expressionists, and Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg. People are like, well, that's something new. That's a departure from Romanticism. And I contend it isn't. It simply strips away all of the order and rules, really, of Romanticism and leaves it out really on the fringe in these dodecaphonic 12-tone compositions that don't have a tonal center. And they sound crazy, maybe a little bit chaotic, a little bit random, if you will, because that was part of their purpose. But they're exhausting the limits of Romanticism. They're really kind of creating music on the fumes left over from Romanticism, if you will. But it's still technically part of Romanticism. So when does it switch? When does 20th century music really begin? And that's a very difficult thing to kind of pin down. I think we really need to go back to 1927, 1928, Jerome Kern and Showboat. And we get this great little song. That we have in the show, sung by a European-American woman, but she's singing it in the style of the African-American people that are on the boat. That's the first time that happens. And what we really see from there, moving forward after 1928 through the 1930s, and we look at Gershwin and Porgy and Bess, we can look at some of these other things where we start to see an acculturation, a blending together of European American culture and African American culture. Now, make a long story short, we can basically take any piece of music, anything from Pat Boone, which is maybe 90% European influence, but there's still a small little bit of influence of other people in popular music and rock and roll. And some of that has its foundation in African American music, things with a heterogeneous sound ideal as opposed to European music, which has a more homogeneous sound ideal. And we see these things get confused or blended together in all kinds of interesting music. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is pluralism. That's exactly what pluralism is. And if we start to look at music of the second half of the 20th century in particular, there really isn't anything that we can look at that we can't really identify the pluralistic nature of each piece. Other than those pieces that maybe still belong in Romanticism, even in the 1960s or so. But we can start to examine all kinds of different music during this time period and start to examine what parts of it contain a homogeneous sound ideal, those things, the virtues of calculation and divisive rhythms and things that come from European music, and those things that have a heterogeneous sound ideal, things that where the music is hot rhythm and things like that, and things that come from African American music and how they come together. Of course, jazz is a great example of this. All kinds of jazz really are combinations of different elements relating to European music and African music. So it really is a great example. But we can also see this in music like by the Police. Sting and the Police, for example, I think is a great example because what we see in them is a reggae band. We have two Brits and an American in London in a reggae band. They're playing reggae music, which is music that belongs to African descendants living in the Caribbean, and they're English and American. So they're bringing their own kind of style, if you will, into their preferences, if you will, into that kind of music. So it isn't really exclusively Caribbean music. It doesn't sound, the Police don't sound like every other reggae band coming out of Jamaica. They sound a little bit different, and that's because that's part of that bringing together of those elements, creating pluralism. In classical music, we can look at a composer such as John Tavener, who was an English composer, but unlike a lot of other English composers, he grew up in the Orthodox Church. So instead of using Sarum chant or English chant as kind of the foundation for maybe the flow and rhythm and the style and the character of the music, he's relying on elements that come further from the East in these Orthodox chants. So his music really is a combination of Orthodoxy and English choral music. And we get this unique kind of style in his music, the John Tavener style. And as we begin to explore all these other different types of music, from classical music to popular music to hip-hop music, we can start to see where parts of this music come from different backgrounds. And they are a bringing together of these elements. In the next episode, which I'm getting ahead of myself a little, but in the next episode, we're going to talk about Peter Gabriel. We're going to talk about his album called The Passion, which was the music to The Last Temptation of Christ, the Scorsese film, and how he brought in musicians from 36 different countries to contribute to this album and created this world music thing that's going to explode and take off. But when we look at this album, it's still Peter Gabriel. He's still English. And so we have elements of things that are related to his style, combined with this world music style into this new form of pluralism. Of course, that explodes, and record sales all around the planet, and we have French rap, and we have all kinds of interesting music coming out of the East. In Africa, all of these amazing things that come together that combine some Western elements of music with their traditional, maybe folk customs combined together, creating a new style, which I think should be referred to as pluralism. Really, when we break things down, it's not like we need an exact date. We can say the Baroque began in 1607 in the city of Mantua with Monteverdi and writing the Madrigal Book 5 and writing L'Orfeo and all of the changes in style to the monodic style, this different texture with melody and accompaniment. And we can go, there's the beginning of the Baroque. It's not so clear then when we move into the classical period. Like Bach and Handel are kind of the end of that Baroque, but the next generation of composers, like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, for example, and young Franz Joseph Haydn, are going to be in a more galant style, which becomes the foundation for the classical period. But it doesn't happen overnight. And so we can look at examples from the end of the Baroque, the beginning of the classical, the middle of the 18th century, and examine maybe what pieces of music are leaning more towards the Baroque and which ones are starting to lean a little more towards the future. It also begs the question, if Mozart had lived longer, would he have ushered in Romanticism and not Beethoven? I mean, if we really kind of look at the last set of piano concertos, the last three symphonies, 39, 40, and 41, we start to see a little bit of the building the way towards Romanticism, but we're not quite there yet. So it's fascinating. These time periods don't come in neat clean, cookie cutter shapes that we can just easily label and say this is when this began and this is when this ended. It's art. It reflects the human condition, and the human condition over time changes. So music changes with it. So what I want you to consider is examining your use of the term 20th century music and ask yourself, what does that really mean? And is there a better thing that we could call this time period? My conclusion is yes, and we should call it pluralism because that's really what's going on. And so I hope this video kind of helps lead us towards referring to this time period differently than we do now. We're deep into the 21st century. We're 20 years into it. It's time to stop referring to this time period, as, I guess, if you will, 20th century music. The 20th century is over. It's time to kind of pick up with things. So we don't want to call it, the age of COVID-19 or something like that. We want something a term that really reflects what we see in the music, and I think this one term can reflect what's going on in just about every kind of music around the world, from the early 1930s, late 1920s, until the music of today. Hope you've enjoyed today's session. As I said, we'll see you next time when we examine the music of Peter Gabriel and his Passion. Thank you for joining us on Dr. Todd Talks Tunes.